Hi, this is the 3.3 Reconstruction Summary. So we just got finished with the Civil War. Now we're going to start talking about Reconstruction. So what our standard is for this unit is you're going to be able to need to analyze the effects of Reconstruction on the southern states, and you're going to have to analyze the role of the federal government. We're going to have to talk about the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments and how that affected opportunities for African Americans. This is a very important unit. This is a somewhat confusing unit, so we will go over a lot of this in class. This is really just the bare outline to go with the notes. We will spend a lot more time in class in the next couple of days going over this. So Reconstruction. What Reconstruction was meant to do was to put the United States back together. I know Reconstruction kind of alludes to the fact that we're trying to rebuild the South, but that's actually not what is happening. The South is destroyed badly, but that's not what Reconstruction is about. Reconstruction is about putting the South back into the United States politically and basically reestablishing the full participation of the southern states in the Union. And so that's going to be a little bit of a challenge because the southern states just lost the war and they don't necessarily want to be put back into the Union. During Reconstruction, former slaves got a lot of rights, but those rights really disappeared as soon as the Army left the South. And that's kind of one of the big ideas for this unit. So during that time period, democracy expanded a tremendous amount, but it is going to go away when Reconstruction comes to an end in 1877. So just to reiterate, Reconstruction is putting the South back into the Union politically. It's not about rebuilding the South. The reason why Reconstruction ends up turning more radical, because at first Reconstruction is very lenient, but then it's going to end up turning more radical. And it turns more radical because of what's happening in the South. The actions of the Southerners really push Reconstruction to become more radical. For one thing, the Southern states instituted black codes. These were very similar to the old slave codes, which basically put restrictions on African Americans that almost put them back in slavery-like conditions. Like, for instance, put curfews in place or put restrictions on African Americans from doing certain activities. Another thing that happened was the South elected former Confederates to Congress. So basically, they elected the same people who broke away from the Union. And so that's going to cause some tension in the North, the fact that the South lost, but then they go back to acting the exact same way they were acting before the Civil War. Another problem is that there are a lot of vigilante groups in the South, like the Ku Klux Klan, who are terrorizing African Americans, who are causing lots of trouble and not really wanting to change to the new reality and the fact that the North won the Civil War. As a result, Congress started to get more involved in Reconstruction. They started to turn it more radical because they realized the Southerners really weren't changing things like they wanted. So this is what was called Congressional Reconstruction. We'll talk about presidential and Lincoln's 10% plan a little bit in class, but Congressional Reconstruction is really the one that you should know about for our purposes. Congressional Reconstruction is led by radical Republicans. They really want to change things. They want to try to protect African Americans. They view the Civil War as a moral cause that they fought so that they could get African Americans their freedom and then put African Americans into the Union as full participants. And so what they have to do is they actually have to put the Army in the South in order to protect African Americans. And this works very well. When the Army is in the South, African Americans actually have a lot of rights in the South. They also impeached President Andrew Johnson. Johnson was a Southerner. He tended to oppose the radical Reconstruction. He tended to oppose rights for African Americans. So they actually impeach him. They don't kick him out of office. He misses it by one vote. But that really causes him to be powerless. He's not able to really stop anything that Congress is doing. And Congress has enough members where they can override any vetoes that Johnson issues. So now we get into what they actually do. The first thing is, and these are all really, really important. Everything on this slide is really, really important that you need to know. The 13th Amendment frees the slaves. Southern states could not rejoin the Union until they recognized this amendment. The Black Code showed that Southern states were not willing to recognize the rights of former slaves. So therefore, they passed what was called the 14th Amendment, which gave citizenship rights to former slaves. And what it does is it basically says that all citizens have equal protection under the law, and it also gives them due process. So for instance, if they're charged with a crime, then they have a right to represent themselves and a right to state their case. And we'll talk about exactly what the 14th Amendment does. It's actually one of the most important amendments of the Constitution, especially for you and for me as well. The 15th Amendment what it does is it gives all male citizens the right to vote. So now the only people who can't vote are females. So basically, this increases democracy in the United States. All male citizens are able to vote. And as long as the federal troops, the United States troops, are in the South, those rights are going to be protected. African Americans are going to be able to vote. They're going to have most citizenship rights, and they're also going to be freed. Now, as soon as those federal troops, those United States troops, leave the South in 1877, African Americans are going to lose a lot of those rights, which we'll talk about in the next unit. Some results of the Civil Rights Amendment: African Americans start moving away from their old plantations. They exercise that little bit of freedom. They get away from their old plantations. However, most still stay farmers in some way. They move to another farm, but they still end up farming. And so, I mean, that makes sense, really. Their whole lives, they've only done this one skill, working on a farm. They're not going to feel comfortable trying to move away and do something else. So most end up staying as farmers. Some African Americans do move west. These are called the exodusters, named after the book of Exodus, as in they're leaving slavery. Most of them, when they go west, they stay as farmers. Former slaves actually began to attend their own churches so that they could worship how they wanted to, and that kind of shows the difference between African American churches and white churches today and why they are different. And then one of the really big things that happens is the Freedmen's Bureau is created by the national government. What this is meant is to help former slaves by starting schools, because remember, they couldn't read and write, so these schools were meant to help teach African Americans and these freed slaves. And it's also meant to help negotiate with white farmers on their behalf. The Freedmen's Bureau is an awesome idea. It's a great idea to help get these former slaves able to participate fully in society. The Freedmen's Bureau is so very important. In the South, one reason that they wanted to get that Republicans wanted to get former slaves the right to vote is because those former slaves would then vote Republican. There are three groups in the South that vote Republican during Reconstruction. The first are called the carpetbaggers. These are Northerners that moved south. And you think about like the carpet bag, like they had like if you ever see like those old cartoons, there's like a stick with like a carpet bag on the end of it. That's what it was named after. And then you also have scalawags. These are Southerners that become Republicans. And they usually do that out of some sort of financial interest and it's usually being called a carpetbagger or scalawag would have been very negative at the time. No one would have wanted to be referred to as a carpetbagger or a scalawag. The third group that always voted Republican in the South are African Americans. They always vote Republican because they view the Republicans as the ones who freed them. And they're going to vote Republican in the South up until FDR in the 1930s. That's when a lot of African Americans will switch to the Democratic Party, which they're still today. The South is actually very democratic during Reconstruction. A lot of people have the right to vote. More people than ever before have the right to vote in the South. And as long as I said before, and I keep hitting this over and over, as long as the federal troops, the United States Army, is in the South, then these African Americans are going to be able to vote. And it's going to be a very democratic place. In fact, actually, African Americans are elected to some of the state representatives, state legislatures. South Carolina has quite a bit of African Americans in the state legislature. So it's very, very democratic. The thing is, though, Reconstruction ends up being a failure, which we'll talk more about in the next unit, because it really doesn't help African Americans economically. African Americans were promised during the war 40 acres and a mule. That basically what would happen is they'd get 40 acres of land and a mule so they could start farming for themselves. Well, the question is, where's that land going to come from? That land would have to come from taking it from the white owners, the previous masters, the previous plantation owners, the previous people who had supported the South. Well, Congress is really unwilling to do that. They're unwilling to take land away from a group and give it to another group. They don't want to do that whole major land distribution. So what ends up happening is that President Johnson ends up vetoing the Freedmen's Bureau and ends up not being passed again. And that was such an important group to help teach African Americans and educate them and help give them a chance to succeed. And they don't actually get their promised 40 acres and a mule. Instead of plantations, what ends up happening is African Americans go back to work on white-owned land as sharecroppers or renting it through like the crop lien system. And it's really like I'll talk more about sharecropping here. This is really the cycle of sharecropping, and it's really interesting. So it seems like they're free. They basically are going to rent the land. They're going to get land and seed from the guy who owns the land. They're going to end up having to buy food and clothing on credit from generally the landowner's store. and then they're going to end up planting and harvesting their crops, and then they're going to give the landowner the crops to sell, and they're also going to get about half the earnings minus what they already owed. And so if you're following this whole thing, really what's happening is they're really not making anything, and what they are is they're staying in debt. And so it's almost like they're just keeping the cycle of slavery, except they're free, and they have to give the landowner most of what they own. And we'll talk more about that in class, and I'll try to really explain it a little bit better in class. What you really need to know about sharecropping is it doesn't really give African Americans a chance to succeed economically. It really just keeps them in debt for years and years and years and years, and it's just a cycle that they can't ever break. So, if summarize, Reconstruction was a success while the troops are there. When the Union soldiers leave the South, it ends up going back to the way it was, and so it ends up being really a failure in the end, and we'll talk more about that in the next unit. If you don't understand anything, which I know there's a lot of information in this, and that I went through it pretty quickly, rest assured that we will go over it more in class, and that I'll be able to answer any questions that you have. Just let me know. So when you're done, please go to Canvas, turn in the notes guide, and also take the video quiz. And remember to write your name on it. Thank you very much.